2 years ago this coming week, Edward Snowden, a former U.S. National Security Agency contractor, made headlines and a bit of history when he revealed that intelligence agencies were systematically tracking Americans' phone calls, capturing their emails and their metadata through a series of surveillance tools. Mainstream news coverage painted Snowden as either a hero or a pariah. President Obama said he welcomed the debate pitting the need for national security versus the right to privacy. Yet his Secretary of State, John Kerry, still calls Edward Snowden a traitor and a coward. But this week, Congress may hand Snowden his biggest victory to date, because on June 1st, one of the most controversial sections of the US Patriot Act, exposed by Snowden, the part that gives the NSA some of its powers, will expire. Congress is torn over renewing the law, and if it doesn't, there's another piece of legislation lying in wait. It's called the USA Freedom Act. It would reform the NSA and effectively end aspects of the surveillance program as we know it. But is this really Congress's decision to make? It turns out that there was a meeting held in the British countryside a couple of weeks ago involving a who's who of tech giants and former intelligence chiefs, a band of big brothers, discussing behind closed doors where surveillance is going. Our starting point this week is Washington, D.C., where the clock is ticking and Congress is undecided.
The core issue essentially is liberty versus security.
Whether the government should be able to get information about innocent people who have no connection to terrorism simply in the name of national security.
Where do questions of national security impinge on our rights in a democratic society?
But defense hawks have argued that the intelligence community would find it difficult to prevent another 9/11 if they didn't have these programs in place.
But regardless of how this current debate ends, there's still a lot of work to be done.
A sunset clause looms over Washington, a provision within the Patriot Act that expires on the 1st of June. Unless Congress agrees to renew Section 215 of the law, and as of yet, the numbers, the votes, are just not there, the NSA stands to lose the legal pretext it requires to sweep up phone records and to do it in bulk.
As we do this interview, we're days away from the legal expiry of that particular section. History isn't yet written because the Senate has to sit down at the last minute and debate whether to allow the act to die and indeed whether to pass an act that would go further in curbing the surveillance.
And the program that's been debated and discussed most often is the call record program. And that's the program where the government has collected information about every call Americans make, who they call, how long they speak to them. And it's a program that's operated in virtual secrecy before Edward Snowden. And just earlier this month, a federal court found that that program actually violated provisions of the Patriot Act. It was illegally operated.
And there is a small faction of lawmakers who believe that that court ruling is an outlier, that these programs are being mischaracterized. But the fight is really between the defense hawks in Congress and the lawmakers who are a combination of progressives as well as libertarians, and who believe that this is a government overreach to be sweeping records in this sort of bulk form.
So the challenge for Congress is trying to pass a bill that will assuage some of the liberty concerns, while also maintaining a robust national security structure that allows it to deal with the threats posed by groups like ISIS, posed by cyber warfare. So there are some of the dynamics that are playing out.
The NSA's supporters in Congress are trying to get the Patriot Act's Section 215 renewed, while simultaneously trying to stop the passage of the USA Freedom Act. One of the Freedom Act's authors, Jim Sensenbrenner, was also instrumental in the creation of the Patriot Act in 2001. However, Sensenbrenner says that the NSA has misused those powers, gone far beyond the intent of the legislation, and that it's time to put the NSA's metadata program out of business. The way for Congress to do that, he argues, is to pass the USA Freedom Act.
And what that bill would do, it would end nationwide collection, and it would end the ability of the government to get large amounts of records of, say, an entire zip code or state. But what the act wouldn't do is stop the government from going to the phone companies and still requesting large amounts of information, much of which could be completely irrelevant and associated with people with no nexus to terrorism.
What is being argued over in the US at the moment would basically mean that the telephone records go out of the government's hands and into the hands of the telecom agencies themselves. I don't necessarily see this as being a big problem if the US government gets out of the telephone collection game and passes it over to the companies. Most in the intelligence community would be relatively relaxed about that, providing that the information could then be accessed in a reasonably quick manner.
Against the political backdrop of congressional deliberations, an extraordinary gathering was held across the Atlantic. Some reports called it a secret meeting. The organizers prefer to call it private. It happened 2 weeks ago at a country manor in Britain and brought tech giants such as Apple, Google, and Vodafone together with spy chiefs, current and former, from the US, Britain, Germany, France, Australia, and Canada, as well as a select few journalists to talk about the future of surveillance. What was said remains officially off the record, but one of the participants has shed some light on the proceedings.
The conference organizers asked me and the current boss of Britain's spy agency, GCHQ, to open the conference together and try and chart issues that people should discuss. Quite remarkable for the person who's running the spy agency. And in the light of Snowden, it was obviously, in their thinking, an appropriate thing to do publicly, to be seen to be joining the debate by putting their top official beside one of the loudest critics.
But to have the actual policy heads from Google and Apple convening with the intelligence community shows just how pressing this issue is, not just from the perspective of privacy, but also from a business perspective, because one of the arguments that Google and Apple and other companies have made is that they are losing overseas business because there are customers overseas who don't want their information, their records, to also be gathered by these companies, by the federal government over here.
Both sides are appealing to the public. Intelligence agencies are under pressure, so they are trying to justify their actions. And at the same time, large technology companies, if they face a revolt from their customers, they'll obviously tell the intelligence agencies to back off. If the intelligence agencies exert sufficient pressure on them, they'll cooperate with the intelligence agencies. They are primarily interested in profit, in their public image, and they will do whatever they deem to be most beneficial to that public image.
The other thing we've been told about that private tech summit is that no one, not even the spy masters, was interested in shooting the messenger. Unlike the politicians in DC, the consensus, reportedly, was that it's time to move on and focus on the message.
This was such a meeting of minds, and nobody wanted to do the tired stuff like, is Edward Snowden a traitor? Even if they hated what Edward Snowden had done, they completely acknowledged that he had changed the world, and that was why we were meeting.
On the download this week, our viewers on the coverage of the surveillance story.
I don't see the kind of tough questions and accountability being asked of the NSA and of other high-ranking federal agencies. We could start by asking the questions to presumptive presidential candidates. Will you support amnesty for Edward Snowden if you're elected president?
It's not that surprising that America spies on other countries, and it's easy to make the case that's in Americans' best interests. So running to China and then cozying up to Russia so he could talk about global surveillance programs often conducted with the help of our allies made Snowden look like a defector. Whether or not he's a traitor, he definitely does not come across as a patriot, and that's going to continue to hurt his case in America.